You have to take the hot seat over here,
Yes.
right? Okay. Good evening. Can you hear me in the back all right? Good. Several months ago, I heard Don Lee say that he needed volunteer speakers. And in a weak moment, I decided to volunteer to talk about my experiences in the 8th Air Force strategic bombing of Germany, as limited as my experience was. The title of my talk and its focus on several key areas was arrived by utilizing Don's experience in this program of keeping alive the memories of World War II. My experience in the Army Air Corps started on, guess what, 7 December 1942, which was a year after Pearl Harbor Day. I was called an Avenger of Pearl Harbor, which I really wasn't. I was dodging the draft. I was involved in the aviation cadet program and became a bombardier on 18 March 1944. I arrived in the 8th Air Force on November the 2nd of 1944 and was assigned to the 486th Bomb Group, the 3rd Air Division. We're one of the last of the 4 or 5 groups that made up the 8th Air Force in its final arrangement. I completed 16 combat missions, and I was over there, as I say, from 4th of November to the end of the war, and simple division shows that I flew about 3 missions a month. Not a very good use of my time, but boy, listen, it wasn't too bad. But present today is an airman who completed 35 missions in 86 days during the same time frame as my service in England. Jack Durkin. Where's Jack Durkin? Stand up, Jack. Jack sort of just smiles when I say I was in the 8th Air Force compared to what he was doing. With so few missions, most of them well after we had destroyed much of the German Air Force, I decided to talk of events that made the strategic bombing mission more difficult and costly in men and materiel, and others that really shortened the war. Many of you heard Jack Agnew's outstanding program on his experiences as a paratrooper. He vividly described the close combat of the infantry and the airborne against the Germans. The air war wasn't anything like that. It was a lot different in that it was very impersonal compared to Jack Agnew's war, or the infantry's war. We never saw the anti-aircraft gunners that shot at us. We very seldom saw the pilot of the German fighters, except fleetingly as they broke through the bomber group. And while we were not unconcerned with the destruction we left behind after a mission, the hell that we perceived were just pillars of smoke, and not the human anguish that existed beneath those smoke pillars. Additionally, Jack Agnew could visit, with the use of a survey map, every move that his unit had made in World War II. He could and has visited those battlefields, but the air battlefields were not defined solely by latitude and longitude, but also by altitude. The battlefields were moving at 150 miles an hour from the German border to the target and back again. The 10 men who made up a bomber crew flew together and too often bled and died together. Their war was fought inside of a thin-skinned, heaving airplane. Their war was against machine gun bullets from enemy fighters, shells from anti-aircraft guns, fire due to oxygen or hydraulic fluid in the airplane. Extremely cold weather. I mean cold. Minus 65 degrees at 26,000 feet. Mechanical failures of the plane. Lack of oxygen. And yes, even fate itself. The aerial battlefields cannot be revisited. No trenches or cannon shells can be found. The evidence of air combat, that is flak bursts, phosphorus tracer shells, the smell of cordite, the shouts of airmen, the roar of machine guns and engines, chunks of metal penetrating human flesh, and the airplane itself vanished as suddenly as they appeared. The only thing that remains is the images that each airman retains of every mission he flew. Some airmen have never completely recovered from these experiences. The agenda overhead, Dawn, please. The agenda slide shows the topics that I'm going to talk about in their respective orders. And the first one is, what if the Germans had discovered the best kept secret of World War II? Anybody here want to guess their opinions?
Breaking the code.
Breaking the code, that's a good one, that's a good one. Radar, good. Bomb sight, good.
The code breaking.
Well, we've heard that 4 times. It's four already for code breaking. Oh, there's a guy that heard me the other day. Anybody else?
Landing at Normandy?
That was pretty good. But
Are you going to list all of those, or do you want me to cover them?
no, take the slide down. Take the slide down. I'm going to talk about the best kept secret of World War II, and that's the proximity fuse. The information in my talk was taken from the book They Never Knew What Hit Them by Ralph Baldwin, one of the developers of the proximity fuse. The Navy was responsible for pushing the development of this weapon because they had seen how vulnerable the English Navy's capital ships had been to Japanese airplanes. The development program was the brainchild of Vannevar Bush, that great scientist. Eventually, 700 people worked on the development. Work was done in 110 plants, which produced the required 87 components. The security of this program was unbelievable, and it prohibited the Germans from learning of the proximity fuse. Prior to the proximity fuse, all anti-aircraft fire relied on timed fuses, volume of fire, that is the number of shells per minute, altitude and speed calculations of the target, plus sheer luck to explode anywhere near the target.
Did you wind it up now?
Yes. That's a view of one of the Mark V proximity fuse.
Mark 45.
45. And if you give us the next slide, Don. Thank you. The proximity fuse was designed to explode when it came within 75 feet of an airplane or other targets that reflected radio waves. In the nose of the shell, protected by plastic, was a transmitter receiver that sent out a radio wave, would bounce off of an airplane or a brick wall or something like that. It would then start the ignition stream here that would eventually go through the nose of the shell into the explosive part of the bomb. As you can see, a radical improvement over just a time fuse. For example, a German shell fired at one of the bombers could go through the bomber and not explode because the timer had not timed out. Eventually it would explode when the timing went out. So this means that they had to fill the air with a tremendous number of shells to come anywhere near knocking planes down. You can take the slide off, Don. The device was first used by the Navy on targets only over water to prevent any unexploded shells falling into enemy hands exposing the secret of the fuse. The first successful use of the proximity fuse was on the cruiser Helena on the 5th of January 1943 during a Japanese air attack off Munda. The Helena gunner tracked the Akai bomber for 45 seconds and shot it down in less than a minute and a half. Comparing to what they used to do, it probably would have taken about 60 shells, and this took about 14. The first fuses fired over land was used by the Navy in support of the infantry landing in Sicily on 10 July 1943. A group of German 75-ton Tiger tanks were approaching a beach area of infantry with no heavy artillery support. Forward observers called in the Navy, which destroyed the tanks and supporting infantry using proximity fuses. After this battle, all uses of the fuse once again were confined to overwater firing. The fuse was used very successfully on the V-1 bomb blitz on London. I think we have, where is she? Where is Lillian? Lillian remembers the V-1s. The success rates improved from 24% the first week to 67% the third week. 67% of the V-1s, and believe me, they were coming over just like clockwork when used by the English gunners. The Germans launched another V-1 blitz on Antwerp on 24 October 1944, and the success rate there was 79%. Incredible, incredible accuracy. During the Battle of the Bulge, in late December of 1944, the 9th and 1st Armies used the fuse to destroy German armor and armored infantry carriers. The pictures that one sees of the devastation wrought by the proximity fuse was just incredible when compared to regular timed fuses. If the Germans had the proximity fuse, they would have decimated our bomber forces, and the D-Day landings would have resulted in terrific losses. Additionally, their use of the fuse would have reduced the number of men and resources they had dedicated to stopping our bombers. It was estimated that approximately 1 million German soldiers were involved in air gunnery defense, plus the tremendous number of 88 and 105 millimeter cannons, and all the shells used against our bombers. There is no question that the fuse shortened the war and saved countless Allied lives. It truly was the best kept secret, because even the Russians, with their outstanding spy system, never discovered the secret until several years after World War II. Agenda slide, please, Don. What if long-range fighters were available before the fall of 1943? One of the most significant deterrents to the strategic bombing of German industry and transportation was the lack of long-range fighters to protect our bombers on raids into Germany. And one might ask, how we developed a plan without supplying the required resources to carry out the plan. The reasons were manifold. The first had been a myth generated by the Bomber Command, which simply stated that the firepower of a group of B-17s or B-24s was so powerful that the German fighters would not be able to penetrate the group and destroy our bombers or drive them off of their course. Our early losses to fighters should have corrected that myth. Second, the Air Corps published in September of 1941 a directive which precluded the use of auxiliary tanks to increase the range of all new fighters and thereby assist the bomber groups. This directive was published with the knowledge that Rudolf Hess used auxiliary tanks on his Messerschmitt Bf-110 when he defected to Scotland on the 10th of May, 1941. about 4 months before the publication of the directive. On December the 7th, 1941, the Japanese Zeros from the aircraft carriers used auxiliary tanks to give support to torpedo and dive bombers at Pearl Harbor. Additionally, the Flying Tigers had used our P-40s with auxiliary tanks to extend their range in the Pacific. Thirdly, the designer of the P-47 supported the ban of no auxiliary tanks by saying, "I don't want any ornaments being hung on my sleek fighter." I think somebody forgot the real purpose of fighters, which was to support the bombers at that time. Unfortunately, the myth prevailed. We sent our bombers over Germany in late 42 and 43 with devastating losses. These early losses finally brought pressure on Brigadier General Frank Hunter, head of the 8th Air Force Fighter Command, to develop an auxiliary tank and start using it as soon as possible on fighters to support our bombers. Hunter in May of 43 directed Major Cass Huff to begin developing a suitable auxiliary tank. Unfortunately, the auxiliary tanks did not arrive before the Schweinfurt-Regensburg missions in August of 43. We lost 60 bombers on those missions. That's about 600 young airmen. Next slide, please, Don. This slide shows the picture of a P-47, and I'm going to say that they used a single 75-gallon tank. This picture was the only one I could find that used a double tank. That must have been taken probably around early 44. But by adding the 75 gallons, it increased their effective range from 200 to 325 miles in October of 43. Well, this was a significant improvement. It would not allow the P-47s to support the bombers on raids deep into Germany. For example, the distance from the German border or the city of Aachen to Schweinfurt was about 200 miles, which means 400-mile round trip from the border back. The use of tanks on P-47s did, however, help reduce our bomber losses. Next slide, Don. In late 43 and early 44, the P-51, with its 625-mile radius, helped increase the German fighter losses significantly. This is a picture of a real airplane. Not that the 47 was, but it's beautiful on the ground, it's beautiful in the air. But they used, you can see, two tanks, and it really didn't distract from its beauty as far as I was concerned. But it was most effective. The losses of the German fighters increased significantly, and the bomber losses, strangely enough, also decreased. Without long-range fighter support, the 8th Air Force bombers would not have been able to destroy German industry and the transportation system. The payoff really came on D-Day, June the 6th, 1944. You can take the slide off, Don, please. When our landings were made without interference from the German Air Force. I wonder how many airmen's lives would have been saved had we had adequate fighters early in the war. Agenda slide, please. What if the bombing accuracy was as good as predicted? Put the next slide on, please. The data used in this presentation was obtained from the February-March 1995 issue of Air and Space magazine by Don Sherman. The Norden bomb sight pictured was touted as the war-winning piece of equipment, so valuable that during early training, the bombardiers would remove the bomb sight from their airplanes and under guard return them to the bomb sight vault. In combat, they were told to destroy the site to prevent the enemy obtaining the secret of the bomb sight. The truth was that the Germans had obtained complete detailed plans of the Norden bomb sight in 1940. By then, the Luftwaffe had little interest in the site because they had preferred low-altitude dive bombers and had developed a radio signal type bomb site for higher altitudes. By the way, this bomb site was used to bomb Coventry on November of 1940. Essentially, the Norden bomb site was an analog computer designed to determine the exact moment to release a bomb to hit the target. Next slide, please, Don. But keep that one handy. The bombardier must... Well, you're getting better, Don, anyway, you know. My wife was here this afternoon, and she's a couple of weeks older than Don, and she has arthritis in her hands, but she's getting more deaf than you are, Donald.
You can't get good help anymore.
Well, I'll tell you, it's tough. The bombardier must input two key pieces of data into the site: the actual time of flight of the bomb and its trail. The actual time of flight depends on altitude and the bomb's aerodynamic characteristics extracted from reference tables. Trail is the amount of forward momentum the bomb loses after release from the airplane. Here's the trail, and if the bomb was dropped here, and here's the airplane at this point, this distance is called trail. Trail is also dependent on the altitude and the bomb's air resistance. This data was also obtained from reference tables. Let's have the reverse slide there. That's it, the bomb site slide. And keep the other one handy. By adjusting rate adjustment knobs, the bombardier would place the crosshair of the sight on the target. The setting would correspond to the actual ground speed of the plane. He then engages the mirror drive, which is driving the mirror inside of this part of the unit. And now the bomb sight and the ground speed of the airplane are completely coordinated. Next, the bombardier levels the bomb sight by uncaging the gyro. This is the uncaging mechanism. The gyro is in this quadrant. And he directs the pilot to level the airplane to establish a completely level bombing platform. Simultaneous adjustments of drift and turn knobs set the drift angle, which compensates for the crosswind. When the bombardier splits the target with a vertical crosshair, the airplane is now on a course capable of hitting the target. And it usually did. To the right of the telescope quadrant, there's an index section. It has two pointers on an index scale. The one on the right is the dropping angle, which is being solved. On the left is a pointer which moves as the sighting angle between the aircraft and target decreases, that is, getting closer to the target. When the left aligns with the right pointer, a contact is made and the bombs are dropped automatically. Now, if all of the data has been input correctly, and if the plane was perfectly leveled at the time of release, the bomb would hit the target, or reasonably close. One of the primary reasons for inaccuracy of the sight of the bombing was the random pitch and roll of the aircraft during the bomb run. In other words, it's extremely difficult for many reasons to keep that airplane straight and level. The Norden sight was indeed an accurate bombing device, but it required excellent cooperation between the pilot and the bombardier to attain anywhere near the promised accuracy. For example, an air of 1 degree bubble when he leveled the plane would result in an air of over 440 feet at 20,000 feet. And at 26,000, that air would be extended to 600 feet. The direction of the air depends on the direction of the tilt. If the plane was in the upper mode, the bombs would go over. If it was down, they would go under. Additional errors could be caused by the altimeter not being corrected automatically by temperature changes. All of these have to be done manually. The altitude is the difference between indicated corrected altitude and the air base altitude. Now, if the target base altitude is much different from the air base altitude, a correction would once again have to be made to eliminate that error. Unfortunately, most errors were cumulative. In early 1944, the 8th Air Force decided to drop bombs. Instead of each bombardier having his own bomb site and dropping bombs individually, they dropped by either groups or by individual squadron bombardiers to ensure better bomb coverage on the target. The tail gun position was generally manned by a co-pilot who would constantly advise the bombardier of the tightness of the formation of the three squadrons. The bombardier would adjust his aiming point to accommodate the formation structure. For example, if squadrons B and C were lagging the lead, he would delay his drop to ensure more bombs on the target. During the latter months of 42, only 5% of the bombs fell within 1,000 feet of the target. All told, the overall accuracy, less than 1/3 of all the bombs dropped in World War II landed within 1,000 feet of the target. Some groups had much better accuracy ratings than the total due to better training and continuous work between the bombardier and the pilot. Neither the site nor the bombardiers were to blame, however. The fault lies with the Precision Strategic Bombing Directive. It is clear that the bombers could not always defend themselves to ensure a stable bomb run, which was one of the great criterias for the accuracy of this site. In spite of the low accuracy levels, we did succeed in destroying the Germans' ability to carry on the war. Additionally, I mentioned that approximately 1 million German soldiers and thousands of anti-aircraft guns were used and were not available in other parts of the war. Let's have the next shot. Should be a flight pattern. This is a mission plan showing that the bomber stream leaves Southwold in England, comes in this direction. This is the front line on the 13th of March, 1945. The purpose of bringing it south of the front line was to avoid as much interference as possible in the front line area. We came down here and then began to work our way towards a target, if you follow the red arrows. This was no easy job of navigation, believe me. You can see all of these numbers are lines of latitude and longitude. So we finally came up here, and this is Nijmegen, and I was in a bomb squadron that bombed Nijmegen. We bombed, the two squadrons bombed Nijmegen visually. The first squadron continued on here and bombed Oranienburg using radar. Their hit percentage was better than our hit percentage visually. There was a serious problem there. But we can see probably why the problem was in the IP was too short, and they never did own up. Then we finally headed on back to England. Now, it's not like an airline where we went from Southwold right over to the target, right? These black circles show heavy concentrations of anti-aircraft batteries. This afternoon, there was a gentleman named Sam Arrows, whose bomb squadron, the 384th, actually designed the concept of these plans to show the airmen where the guns are located. The circle shows the available range of that battery, or those batteries, to hit a bomber at 10,000 feet. Now, if you're at 20,000, these circles get much smaller, so that it makes it more difficult for them to hit. This was also useful in a plane coming back from a raid that's damaged, so that the navigator could then avoid the most intense anti-aircraft batteries. Another reason why it was difficult to aim properly. Let's have the next slide, Don, please. One of the reasons that Jack Durkin was able to, this is a radar bombing, this is a site of Frankfurt. One of the reasons Jack Durkin was able to fly so many missions in such a short time is that we began to use radar bombing, which enabled us to bomb even though we couldn't see the ground. The radar would pick up the targets, and we would bomb just as though you could see the ground. One of the reasons Frankfurt was a good radar target is that very wide river, the River Main, and significant concentrations of metal buildings, marshalling yards, 4 marshalling yards in the area, and they showed up very nicely on radar. And a good bombardier, when looked at the targets, he would know the distance from, let's say, this part of the river to the Adler Werke along the river. And he could plan to drop his bombs with a reasonably good pattern, even though he's dropping through the clouds. So that we were able to extend the time of bombing in spite of the fact that we couldn't see the ground. And you can remove that slide, please, Don. The real heroes of the air war over Germany were those air crews that were sent over Germany in 42 and 43 before we had sufficient resources to conduct a strategic bombing campaign. The losses were significant. The total losses of the 8th Air Force through the war were 28,000 killed in action, and 43,000 became prisoners of war. Had we had better accuracy in bombing, for whatever reason, the war would have been shortened significantly because we went back to targets time after time because we couldn't reduce them. And fewer airmen would have been killed. Agenda slide, please, Don.
Almost got it.
What if the bomber groups had better radar for forming in heavy overcast? Heavy overcast simply means you have clouds from the ground up to wherever. Several years ago, I saw a demonstration of formation radar at the Willow Grove Naval Air Station in an Air Reserve C-130. The pilot could see 11 airplanes on his screen in a complete overcast. Immediately I was transported back to England in 1944. Our plane had taken off and we followed a prescribed method of climbing through the overcast. Picture of England next, please. And some of you might wonder, what's the big deal? We don't have too many days where solid overcasts here, but I'm going to show you, not that one, Don. The one, that's it.
Number 7 here.
That's it. Here's why England was a problem. We have the Gulf Stream coming up in this direction, hitting Iceland, bouncing down, and coming down to Ireland, down the Irish Sea. Warm on this side. Oh, how about this side? It's the North Sea, cold even in summer. You're getting cold air coming off. So what happens? If the wind is basically, the strength is from here, you're blowing this cold air over, meeting with the warm, you're going to get an overcast somewhere. You would never have picked England to have a significant bomber group if you had any other choices, but we had no choice. We had to make the best of it. So, the part of England called East Anglia was home to 100 air bases in World War II. This covered an area of about 80 by 80 miles, which is about 1/3 the size of Vermont. Not a lot of big territory. Included in this area were 40 heavy bomber bases. Because of the high density of the bomber bases, it was necessary to develop takeoff procedures when forming the groups in an overcast. Next slide, please, Don.
Which one you want, the bomber group?
That's it. That's it. That's it. The dots, the open dots, are bomber bases in most cases. And for example, here's the 100th Bomb Group. This is the formation area of the 95th Bomb Group. The 100th Bomb Group has to come through that forming area out here where they can then form and begin to climb. This is a spiral moving from the ground on up until they break through to the top. Now, I'll tell you, climbing through an overcast with knowing that you have planes that could be all around you was stressful. This afternoon we had a pilot from the 100th Bomb Group, Jim Siemens, who said that forming in the overcast was, to him, as stressful as flying the mission. Because you don't know, every pilot and every navigator had to be following the same program. These patterns were so close, timing was so critical, the planes had taken off every 30 seconds, you didn't have a lot of time. Anybody that was flying faster than they should have or slower was creating a problem. Jim Siemens, even today, when he flies in a jet airplane, is still concerned when it flies through the clouds. I'm a little bit too. I'm uncomfortable. For example, if the overcast was 5,000 feet thick, the plane's climbing 500 feet a minute, you're in that suit 10 minutes. It seems like an eternity because you're staring. You can't see anything. You're looking, and you're praying that nothing's out there. During the combat operations, 289 mid-air collisions. Now, assuming that some of the men survived those collisions, you're still talking about probably 1,600 men that were killed.
When somebody had to come back because of aircraft problems, they have to come back through that route?
Well, they'd have to find a different pattern to come back.
Fly into somebody else's.
Oh yeah, well, as you can see, I take the 100th and the 95th because to me it's the worst. These guys have nothing on it. These are basically, a lot of these were B-24. They moved right out into the North Sea here. They could form without any difficulty. It wasn't any, but it was this group down in this area where it was more densely loaded. Oh, radar, formation radar, where were you when we really needed you, right? One additional problem is that the instrument training on some groups was much, much better than others. For example, the combined Regensburg-Schweinfurt raid in August became a disaster when the 4th Bomb Wing under LeMay was able to take off and form on time and left England on time. But the 1st Bomb Wing was delayed 3 hours due to the overcast. The person running that bomber wing would not let the planes try to take off. The delay of 3 hours enabled the Luftwaffe to attack the Regensburg mission, then land, refuel, rearm, and hit the Schweinfurt mission. You can take that down. And you can put the Europe map up there. And then they hit the Schweinfurt mission full force. The Regensburg mission, which continued on to Africa, lost 24 bombers because they didn't have to come back to England. They went to Africa where there weren't the fighters. The Schweinfurt mission lost 36 bombers. 60 bombers lost on that raid.
Out of how many?
Excuse me?
Out of how many?
Probably maybe 400, something like that, 450. Some of the blue lines, blue targets, blue stars here show some of the typical targets. Hanover, tough target, about 105 anti-aircraft guns. Everybody's heard about Dresden and the controversial comments about should they have bombed it or should they not have. Munich, Stuttgart, Remagen, Cologne, Ruhr. Gives you an idea of the distance from England, say, to Berlin. Significant distances. Forming in an overcast also increased the time to form the group, which meant that we were using gasoline that we would probably need on the way home in most cases. And early in the war, that was critical because if you ran out of gas, there was the only place to go was land in enemy territory. At least towards the end of the war, when I was there, or we could land in friendly territory. Agenda. The next item is, if we better understood fear of flying and the use of alcohol by airmen. Some of you may question the title of this segment, but believe me, there was a linkage. My first mission in early December of '44 lasted 7.5 hours, and if we added the 1.5 hours time between the briefing and breakfast, we're talking probably 9 hours. And so it was 9 hours had elapsed since we had a substantial meal. Some of the airmen would have lost their breakfast probably as soon as they got near the airplane or started into the airplane. We landed and were taken to the debriefing area. And as we entered the debriefing building, there was a table with 1 ounce cups Scotch whiskey. No one on my crew took the whiskey, but the crew behind us gave their ration to their bombardier. And he came prepared to accept their ration. He brought his canteen. Between the debriefing and the dinner, the bombardier consumed about 6 to 8 ounces of neat Scotch whiskey. What a blow on an empty system. What a destruction of his thought processes. The bombardier was in my squadron. He passed out during dinner, and it alarmed me that the officers of his crew ignored him. Several of us cleaned him up and put him to bed. This was his 15th mission, and it was sort of known that he drank rather heavily. As I came to know more about him, I believed that he was really masking his fear with alcohol. He died in 1955 because of alcohol usage. There were 2 other squadron airmen that I knew of who became alcoholics. I flew 9 missions with my original crew, and the last 7 missions I flew with 7 different crews. A real experience, believe me. I was a substitute bombardier, and on most of the missions I replaced bombardiers who were either on sick call or became sick after seeing where the mission was going. On my first mission as a substitute, I was alarmed to see that some of the crew were using oxygen prior to takeoff. My questions to the pilot were brushed off with the explanation, well, they were probably just sobering up. Just about destroyed me. A matter of reference, the oxygen supply for a B-17 at 25,000 feet would last the crew about 4 hours at that altitude. If the airmen used oxygen before takeoff, they would be endangering their lives, the lives of the crew, by exposing them to anoxia, which is the extreme end of a lack of oxygen. My exposure to fear of flying was through a co-pilot from another crew in our hut. He's considered a good co-pilot, had a lot of respect from his crew. He was a very religious man and read his Bible whenever the time permitted. On his first mission, he froze on the steering column and had to be forcefully removed by the engineer and waist gunner. He sat in the radio room until they returned to the base. This action was repeated on two other missions until he was sent to the flight surgeon for evaluation. We had become friendly and had discussions on the Bible and our Christian religion. So he asked me to accompany him on his visit to the flight surgeon. The flight surgeon discussed his problem and recommended that he go to headquarters at High Wycombe for evaluation to learn if his fear was genuine or put on. I expressed my concern to my friend that a person as religious as he was would have a difficult time at headquarters convincing them of his fear. He returned in 4 days with the order to continue to fly or be sent to a rifle company on the continent. How do you like that for an analysis by your doctor, huh? Fortunately for him and his crew, the war was over in a few weeks and he only flew 4 missions in the radio room after takeoff. Still had that fear, still had it in him. You know, fear was a commodity not handled well by the military in World War II. I kept in touch with him until he died in 1994. And I often wonder how many young men were as troubled as my friend was. Glenn Enfield, author of the book The Big Week, includes several accounts of airmen manifesting fear by shooting at their own airplanes, changing their personalities completely under combat conditions, as though they were in a hypnotic trance. They're completely out of it. I think that's abject fear. It wasn't until October of 1944 that the Air Force developed a series of rest and recuperation sites called, listen to the term, flak homes, to get the airmen out of the combat for a week and relieve some of that pressure of depression that they were suffering. Some of them were suffering. The qualifications were 15 missions or 6 months in the combat zone. The 7 days were not charged to their leave time, and transportation and the costs of the rest and recuperation were paid by the Air Force. As mentioned earlier, I flew very few missions as measured against total time in combat. You can imagine my surprise when the flight surgeon called me in and said that I was eligible for 1 week in a rest and recuperation home. I didn't need the rest, but I wasn't going to argue with him. Based on my qualification was based on my 6 months in the combat zone. And I have to admit that it was the best week I spent in the European theater of operation. I went to Eynsham Hall, near Oxford, a beautiful old mansion that was taken over by the Air Force. I saw 3 wonderful plays by the Oxford players, very professional actors, as the English are so great even today. Played bridge, fished in the manor pond, shot skeet, did all those things that the owner of Eynsham Hall did prior to World War II. Had a great time. Tom Enfield, assistant editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer, on May the 28th, 1989, wrote an article about his father, my father the hero. In fact, Jack Durkin was interviewed by Tom Enfield and has several paragraphs in the book that Tom Enfield wrote, and I'll discuss that later. He started the article of his father with the death of his father by saying, "My father died an alcoholic, but he was not always a drunk. Once he was a ball turret gunner on a B-17 and completed 25 missions before the end of the war." His article then went on to trace the roots of his father's combat days in England. One more reinforcement of alcohol and fear. To this day, I can't comprehend the Air Force and its use, as I saw it, of alcohol at the end of a mission. I want to close this segment with a personal story about fear of flying. I was scheduled for discharge on the 15th of September 1945. Made reservations to fly to Pittsburgh Airport in Pennsylvania. Some of my friends later said, "George, How are you going to feel about flying without a parachute? I was so naive about the difference between commercial and combat flying that I was not aware that parachutes were not used by civilians in commercial airlines. I immediately canceled my reservations, and made a reservation on the Silver Meteor to Baltimore. Took the Baltimore Ohio Railroad to Pittsburgh, but that ride on that train was so rough I should have flown the airplane. I tried to bring you some interesting aspects regarding the strategic bombing of Germany by the 8th Air Force in World War II. I hope that you found the information interesting as well as informative. As I researched various areas for this paper, I found myself more emotionally involved than I had anticipated. I found myself going back. Keep in mind, I didn't have a tough time at all. My missions were easy. The war was winding down, but I kept thinking that the Air Force lost 28,000 airmen. 40,000 became prisoners. And you know, some of those prisoners of war are not aware or don't believe that World War II is over. And Lawrence Bynum's poem about soldiers killed in action is a fitting remembrance to these men. They did not grow old as we, the survivors, grew old. Age did not weary them, nor the years condemn them. But at the going down of the sun and in the morning, we must remember them, every one of them. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them all. Refer them to all the experts that are out here in the audience. Thank you very much.
Another good story.
Any questions? Yes, sir.
Your proximity fuse went off when it got within 75 feet of the target. If it didn't get within 75 feet of the target, what happened to it?
Well, it just kept going then.
And did it then eventually explode
No.
when it hit something?
No, that's why they were concerned that if it didn't explode, the Germans could get it or the Japanese could get it. But with the radar that we had, the radar-directed gunfire that we had towards the end of the war, I mentioned some of the accuracy rates are just incredible. When you compare that with regular anti-aircraft guns, it was unbelievable. Any other questions? Speak up. You'll never get another shot at me for a long time, I'll tell you. I'm not going to let Don talk me into, scam me into any more of these. Yes?
Was there a limited number of missions that you were expected to fly before they would relieve you and send you home?
Yes. Early in the...
And if so, what was the percentage of airmen who would actually complete that number?
Well, I'll go back to the beginning and say that when it was 25 missions early in the war, they say the average missions that the men would live through would be about 8. Sickeningly high percentage of losses then. Eventually, as we destroyed more of the German Air Force, they raised that from 25 to 35 missions. The percentage of people completing missions increased probably in the same ratio as the decrease of casualties in the Air Force. Yes, sir.
The number of missions was determined by that time you should have been a casualty.
Excuse me?
I said by the 25 missions you should have been a casualty.
Oh, yes. Long before then.
Should have been dead at 8. That's what the worked out. I was a bombardier, I was a squadron bombardier, and when I got into that, and I had the tables, I said, oh, God, that's how they worked it out. Like I had to do 35, because I was a B-29. It was much safer, we had weather, but we had better chances of living than those in Europe.
Good point. Any other? Yes, sir.
When they did blanket bombing,
Excuse me?
when they did blanket bombing on territory, not every plane carried a bomb sight, but
Right, that's correct. Every plane did not carry a bomb sight. We had a gunner sitting in that bombardier location, And when he saw the lead bombardier drop, he dropped his bombs. It's interesting to note that I said I graduated in March of '44. Early '44, they made the decision not to use as many bombardiers, but the training centers didn't stop training bombardiers. They just kept cranking them out. You know, just throwing bombardiers into the combat area and had no real need for them. It was just, well, what are you going to do? Thank God the war's over. And I survived, and we all survived. Any other questions? Once again, thank you for your very, very attention, your strong attention, and I appreciated the questions, and I'm glad I did what I did, even though Don had to twist my arm doing it.
Thank you for coming.